The more laps you get under your belt, the faster you'll become and the more confident you'll be out on circuit. In the previous episodes of this Ultimate Sim Racing Beginner's Guide, we have covered basic car control. We've also covered how to discover the fastest way around the circuit in the form of the racing line. However, back in that first episode, we also mentioned assists. We talked about why using them as sort of, learning tools in order to get up to speed was a good thing, especially when you're beginning your sim racing journey. Now, even though these assists, stuff like traction control, stability control, and anti-lock braking, will help you stay in control of your car, eventually, the further down the line you go, you're not going to want to be relying on them because ultimately, they will make you slower. So whilst they've been a useful tool up until this point, we're going to try and break some of those potential future bad habits by turning these assists off one by one. And it's not just about being able to cope without having them on, it's also about understanding exactly what they've been doing and why it's beneficial to not always have them on. However, if you haven't already seen the first 2 episodes of this Ultimate Beginner's Guide series, I would recommend going and watching those first, so that this one makes complete sense and you can follow along this journey and really get the most out of the sim racing discipline. Now, let's start off by covering ground that we've already talked about, the visual racing line. In the previous episode, we went over everything that's important about learning the racing line, and obviously having this visual racing line assist on in the early stages will help you learn a track that you're new to, and it'll help you get up to speed a little bit quicker. Be careful with using this too much though, because if you have that racing line on when you're racing against other people, for example, whether that be AI drivers or racing online, it's actually going to cause more issues than you might expect. For example, if you've braved out the practice sessions and have experienced a small race with AI or even real opponents, you'll find that there's a good chance your eyes are fixated on that colourful line at times. This can be a big distraction as it takes vision away from your surroundings, and when you're closely following or even attempting an overtake, you can easily miss a braking point and crash into the opposition. Even when you're lapping on your own, an over-reliance on that visual racing line can cause you issues. You're not going to be taking in your surroundings in the same way, you might not be taking in reference points because you'll just be looking at the middle of the road when the red colour starts on the racing line, and what that'll do is essentially stunt your progress in the long run. Driving without the visual racing line does seem a bit daunting at first, but trust me, it'll only get easier with practice. If you saw the last episode, you'll have seen the exercise that I set you to try and learn a new circuit. So drive around with the racing line on, take notes of your reference points for your braking, your turn-in, your apex, and your exit, turn the racing line off, or the visual racing line off I should say, and then begin to build up your speed slowly, changing your reference points as you go. Again, if you haven't seen the previous episode, go and watch that exercise section for this specific part because it's going to really help you know how to learn a new racing line for a new circuit without, crucially, over-reliance on the visual racing line assist. The great thing is you can apply this exercise to any new circuit you're learning, and obviously you can adjust the method to suit you. The more experience you gain, the easier it'll become to work out the ideal racing line. And also, remember that if you're struggling to find the fastest way around a circuit, you can also check out professional drivers' onboards. You can check out hot laps, whether it be sim racing or real racing. You can even check out our traction track guides if we have a video for the specific circuit you're looking at. Another way you can go about learning the ideal racing lines and braking points for a particular circuit is by using an online coaching service. One like trophi.ai, for example, who are sponsoring this series. This is an AI-driven coaching tool that can offer real-time detailed feedback on the go as you're driving, regardless of your experience level. Its live voice coach, Mansell AI, that's Scott Mansell by the way, not Nigel Mansell, will analyse your inputs and your technique in real time and offer real-time feedback through your ears, giving you precise, tailored information to help you get better lap times. So whilst you can and should of course use the basic principles learnt in this series to get up to speed and make your way around the circuit, using something like Trophy AI will help you find those extra little bits of lap time. It'll take things a step further. For all of the information, be sure to check out the link in the description below. And of course, as I've said before, we will be utilising this technology later down the line in this series, so stay tuned for that. For now though, let's look at the next assist. An assist you'll find within many racing games is titled Stability Control. Now this essentially does what you'd expect. It's an assist that will help stabilise the car. Now of course, in terms of the nuances, different racing games may go about stability control in a different way on a technical level, but essentially it's there to try and balance the car when you as a driver make the car imbalanced. So for example, if I was overly aggressively turning into a corner and it would normally induce oversteer, the electronic stability control will recognise that and counteract against your inputs to try and prevent the oversteer and keep the car as balanced as possible. It's worth pointing out as well that a lot of real cars do have ESC, which is electronic stability control, so even though this assist in some uses isn't that realistic, in other uses it very much is. Now of course, when a car is unstable, it's primarily during cornering. This harks back to what we talked about in the first episode when we discussed weight balance, understeer and oversteer. So stability control normally kicks in during cornering. I'm actually going to jump on now though and show you an example of how it actually works. So I fired up Race Room Racing Experience. This is the BMW M235i Racing, and I want to show you how stability control actually works. So at the moment, I've got it turned off. So in theory, this means that when I apply unwanted aggressiveness, let's say, to the driving, nothing's gonna stop me doing that. There's gonna be no intervention from the system and I should lose control. So, for example, we come out of this corner, I'm gonna go up to 100 miles an hour, and then I'm gonna start weaving left and right, and instantly we're in the Armco. So you can see without the aid there, I had no chance. As soon as I started weaving left and right, it imbalanced the car, it sent me into the barrier, there was no saving it. We're going to do one more experiment now on the next bit. We're going to come out of this hairpin and accelerate up to 120 miles an hour. And we're going to do the same thing. Actually, we'll go 130. So 130 now, and we're weaving. And instantly, around we go. Oh, missed the Armco that time. But what's going to happen if we turn on our stability control? In Race Room, there are multiple options for stability. You can have off, low, medium, or high. So we're going to go high to demonstrate this clearly. Okay, so we're coming up to the same part of the circuit. I'm going to accelerate up to 100, and I'm going to try the same thing. So 100, and weave left, weave right, weave left, and look. The car is fully under control. Okay, not fully under control, but I didn't spin. Now we're coming up to the hairpin. I'm going to try the same again, but this time up to 130 miles an hour. It's actually the car struggling to accelerate as much as it was before. 130 now. Oh, even then, we were actually looking like we were going to head towards the Armco, but still the system kicked in and helped us. And we can literally just weave down the straight here. Over the curbs, why not? The car just doesn't want to go into the wall, despite how hard I'm trying. So essentially, what the electronic stability control is doing is preventing you from unbalancing the car by slowing down individually each of the four wheels, depending on which wheel needs to be slowed down. So the idea is there that if, for example, the front left is rotating too quickly or something happens and it's suddenly going to cause the car to spin, the ESC will recognize this, prevent it from happening by cancelling out the power essentially, or actually applying the brakes in some cases, and it keeps you on the road, it keeps you on the straight and narrow. Now obviously with this turned on, especially on a high setting, it is actually going to slow you down, because when you try and put power on out of a corner, you want a little bit of imbalance, but the system is very much fighting against you, so the power doesn't come in, there's extra resistance. Something you might find when you first turn off the stability control is that you're quite easily and quite quickly losing control on the way out of corners when you don't expect to. Essentially, you just need to take it a little bit easier, drive a little bit slower, be a little bit more gentle with your inputs, and you should slowly begin to get comfortable with that stability control turned down or even off. The abbreviation ABS stands for Anti-Lock Braking System, and this is essentially a system that prevents the four tyres from locking up under braking. A lockup, by the way, is simply when the tyre stops rotating under braking, so because it stops rotating, the tyre slides along the surface, creating lots of smoke, and that's known as a lockup. It's all related to grip and friction. When you're trying to slow a car down, essentially what the brakes are doing is creating friction and slowing the rotation of the tyre. At the same time, of course, the tyre is gripping into the road surface, creating its own form of friction. So essentially braking is a battle between the friction created by the brakes on the tyres and wheels and the friction between the tyres and the road surface. The more grip there is available, the less likely you are to lock up the tyres, because essentially more grip means that the tyres are more likely to continue gripping the road and the wheels will continue rotating. If you're driving along an icy surface, for example, and you press the brake pedal, there's basically no friction between the road and the tyre. So as soon as you apply friction to the rotation and try and stop that rotation, the tyre's just going to stop rotating, and essentially the car is going to slide along the surface. In this scenario, a simple way of putting it is that the grip from braking outweighs the grip from the road surface. But with all of that in mind, even on the grippiest road surfaces, if you were to slam on the brake pedal at 100%, the likelihood is if you don't have an anti-lock braking system or ABS turned on, you will probably lock up the tyres. A lockup is bad for a number of reasons. If you lock up the front tyres, it's going to be very difficult to steer the car and you're going to get understeer. If you lock up the rear tyres, then it's going to destabilise the rear of the car and you're probably going to spin off, crash out with oversteer. If you lock up all four tyres, good luck. The best place to view this principle in action is probably Formula 1. You can very clearly see the big white plumes of smoke when the drivers lock up their tyres, apply too much brake pressure for the available grip. And not only does it obviously cause a loss of control, understeer or oversteer, it also damages the tyres. It creates something called flat spots. Because a rubber tyre is circular, when the tyre stops rotating, one part of it slides along the ground, you essentially scrape away that side of the tyre and it creates a flat spot within a circle. Now, obviously, when you think about it, as those tyres continue to rotate, every time that flat spot hits the ground, it's more likely to cause another lockup going forward, and basically, it's going to ruin your performance and ruin your tyre life. I've done a lot of talking in this section, so I'm actually going to go out on circuit and demonstrate ABS in action. So I'm here at Monza in the Audi R8 on Assetto Corsa, and what I'm going to do is turn my ABS on and conduct a little experiment. So, I'm going to accelerate out of the pit lane. The pit lane speed limiter is automatically on, and it will turn off at the exact moment I cross the exit line. I'm going to full throttle accelerate, changing 8,000 RPM, and I'm going to brake just after the tarmac ends and the grass starts on the left with full brake pressure. There we go. Changing down at the appropriate time, and that's me come to a complete stop. Now, what we're going to do is judge the braking distance. So the bush is just ending on the left-hand side. You can clearly see how far away we are from the 100-metre board. The braking felt pretty efficient there. And now I'm going to do exactly the same thing once again, only this time I'm going to have ABS turned off. Okay, so exactly the same experiment. Pit lane speed limiter's on and it's going to turn off at the exact same moment. I'm going to change up through the gears at 8,000 RPM. I'm going to apply 100% brake pressure, but this time with ABS off in exactly the same spot, and we'll see where we get stopped. So now, you can see I'm already past the point from last time, and we can just see the 1 on the 100 board out of the cockpit when the car got stopped. The braking distance was largely increased, and that was simply because we locked up. I mean, we locked up big time. Essentially what happened was the tyres, instead of spinning and continuing to grip the surface, they just slid along the top of the surface, and less friction. Of course, that means you don't get slowed down quite as quickly. I'm going to do one more thing though. For my third attempt, I'm going to do exactly the same, but this time, instead of braking at 100% brake pressure with ABS turned off, I'm going to brake at around about 80 to 90% brake pressure to try and manually avoid a lockup. So you can see the inputs there just above the steering wheel, brake, trying my best to avoid a lockup, a bit of a lockup there at the end, and as you can see, I got stopped quicker than when I did it with ABS turned off. Not as quickly as I got stopped with ABS turned on in the first place. And you could also see there that by modulating the brake pedal at around about 80 to 90%, I actually managed to pretty much avoid a lockup. I did lock up a little bit right at the end, but generally speaking, it was pretty clean. That was, of course, when we were going in a straight line though. What I want to do now is try exactly the same thing, but I'm going to turn the steering wheel, and I want to show you the difference. So, I'm going to brake at 80% here, no lockup, then turn the wheel. Now, if you saw the inputs there, I didn't increase my brake pressure at all. Just by steering the car and trying to brake at the same time, I locked up the wheels again. Let me show you one more time. So I'm not going to do anything different to the brake pedal. I'm going to keep it around about 80%, no lockup, turn the wheel. Instant lockup. Basically, when you're steering the car as well as braking, you're trying to ask the tyres to do too many things at once. You're trying to ask them to grip laterally by turning the car, but you're also trying to ask them to grip in terms of forwards and backwards momentum as well by slowing down the car. So the tyres just can't cope with all of that grip at once, and essentially you get an imbalance. Now what the ABS does, by having it turned on, the computer control system within the car is basically going to electronically recognise when the tyres are about to lock up, and adjust the pressure accordingly. So even if you've got 100% brake pressure on, with ABS turned on, and then you come up to a corner, for example, the system will essentially lift off some of that pressure for you. You won't see it in your own pedal inputs, but the car itself will do the adjustments and it will avoid you from locking up like you would if the ABS was off. Now you might have looked at that demonstration and thought, hang on a minute, the best braking performance was clearly with the ABS turned on, so why are you encouraging us to turn it off? Well, it's true that in many circumstances, especially driving big heavy road cars like this Audi R8, it's actually quicker to have ABS turned on. You can get slowed down faster than when you manually control the pedal, and of course it's less risky as well, less chance of a lockup. But there are certain racing cars where it's actually quicker to brake with ABS turned off, and more importantly, there are plenty of cars out there that don't even have an ABS system, so therefore the game won't allow you to add the ABS assist, and you'll have to just learn to get used to racing without ABS turned on. It's honestly one of the most difficult assists to get used to, but we highly recommend learning the skills, learning how to modulate your brake pressure and manually avoid a lockup, so that when you do eventually do a race where ABS is disabled, you're not going to feel completely lost and you're not going to be locking up at every corner. Traction control is an electronic way of controlling traction. Otherwise known as TC, it reduces the amount of power being sent to the powered wheels when the system detects that there's a loss of traction. Now this is especially relevant when exiting a corner. Usually it's at a lower speed, you're trying to apply the power as quickly as possible, and quite often this will create wheel spin. Traction control will do its best to limit that wheel spin for you, and the stronger the traction control is, the more limiting it's going to be. It sounds perfect on paper, but in reality, if the traction control is too strong, it will cause unwanted power reduction. Of course it's good to limit the power somewhat, but a lot of occasions when the traction control kicks in, it actually takes away more power than it needs to, and you lose lap time, but it will of course help you avoid spinning. We're going to do another demonstration, and a perfect place to go for this would be turn 2 at the Red Bull Ring. So we've picked this particular circuit just because it's a great way to demonstrate traction control's effect. So I'm braking now in the Cayman GT4 at the 100 board, down to first gear. I'm going to accelerate full throttle out of the corner, and instantly the car spins. So I waited until I hit the apex there, got fully on the throttle 100%, and without traction control, so this is with it turned off, I instantly lost the rear end and had a spin. Now let's do it again, but with traction control turned on. So now I'm going to do exactly the same thing, braking at the same point, but this time when I accelerate out of the corner in first gear, full throttle and traction control on, and look, no problem at all. I had the steering wheel turned, fully on the throttle, and the car just accelerated out of the corner. It was a little bit hesitant, it didn't give me all of the power straight away, which is what the traction control is actually doing, but I was able to drive out without losing the back end. Basically what's happening there is the traction control is of course monitoring the power to the rear wheels of this rear wheel drive Porsche that I'm driving. It's realising that if I was to nail the throttle, that I'd just spin the wheels up and that would cause a spin. So therefore it's kicking in, essentially turning down the power that's delivered to those rear wheels, and that's why I'm able to get out of the corner without losing the car, but obviously with reduced power. I'm going to try it one more time, with traction control turned off, but this time I'm going to be more gentle with my throttle inputs. So as I say, I'm going to do everything the same, except this time I'm only going to use a reduced amount of throttle on the corner exit, and then eventually squeeze up to 100% application. So, braking at the 100, down into first gear, okay, turn in, and out on the power now, second gear, about 60, 70, 80% throttle, and then 100%. And that way I'm able to get out of the corner without spinning. Essentially that is manual traction control without any system in place. You have to use your right foot to modulate the throttle pedal and avoid that wheel spin. Now whilst I think ABS is probably one of the most difficult assists to turn off when you're more experienced to avoid locking up, traction control is probably one of the most difficult to turn off when you're a beginner and getting up to speed, just because it takes a lot of time to get used to that muscle control on your right foot to avoid being too throttle heavy and having a spin. You've really got to learn to be gentle on that throttle pedal and wait until the right moment to accelerate fully. I can guarantee you that when you're getting used to this, you will spin out a few times, and that is absolutely fine. Do not worry. Just try it again. Be a little more gentle on the throttle. Even try very, very low throttle, maybe 10 or 20%. Get round it without spinning, like this. And then every time you try again, try a little bit more throttle and see how much you can get away with. Now another thing I need to mention is that you don't have to turn off traction control for all cars. In fact, you shouldn't actually turn it off fully for all cars. Because even some race cars like GT3s, for example, actually use traction control to make them faster out on the circuit. You just change the amount of traction control. And that's something you can do in most sims. I've just paused Race Room. I'm going to go to the options menu. And even on Race Room, and it's very similar on most sims you'll come across, I can actually change the traction control to a factory TC setting. Now, what that's going to do is the game is going to give me the traction control that the actual car I'm driving has in real life. So, for example, if the Porsche Cayman I'm driving has no traction control, then I click factory TC and I should have no traction control. There's another slider here you'll see on Race Room. Again, this is on some games, maybe not others. This is preferred traction control level. So even when you are using traction control, you can actually change the amount that the traction control is going to kick in. So the stronger the traction control is, the more that the engine's going to be limited, or the power is going to be limited. So it essentially means that you're far less likely to crash or spin out with maximum traction control, but it's going to slow you down more. It's all about finding that balance of what you need. Don't feel like you have to turn it completely off straight away, but do try experimenting with lowering your traction control and getting used to the feeling of losing the back of the car. Of course, front-wheel drive is worth mentioning as well. You won't spin out in the same way if you accelerate with a front-wheel drive car, but you will still spin the front wheels, which will cause understeer, which we talked about in episode 1. So traction control is also similarly effective with front-wheel drive as it is with rear-wheel drive, just in a different way. Now, the final assist we're going to cover in this video is optional at this stage in your sim racing journey, because it's probably the one that requires the most practice, the most additional brain capacity, maybe apart from traction control, and that is manual gears. Now, we are going to revisit this subject in great detail later in the series, but because automatic and manual gears are technically an assist, I want to at least briefly talk about it now, and maybe some of you will cope with it just fine, and this will be a good way to get used to manual gears at an early stage. So once again, I'm going to jump out on circuit and talk about why it's important and cover some of the basics. So what do we need to use manual gears when we're sim racing? Well, first of all, we need a gear shifter. So I actually have a secondary shifter on my rig here, which has a sequential option and an H-pattern shifter like you'd find on most road cars, but we don't need this. We don't need to spend extra on an extra shifter straight away, because most steering wheels, and yours probably is the same, it might not be, but I'm pretty sure it will be, most wheels have paddles on the back of the steering wheel that you can use to change gear. So the paddle on the right can be used to shift up through the gears, this here, and then the left paddle with your left hand can be used to shift down through the gears. Now, of course, you might be sim racing for pure realism, at which point, if you want to drive road cars, you're going to need to invest in a clutch pedal, you might need to invest in an additional shifter if your hardware doesn't already include a shifter. But for almost all applications, paddles on the back of the steering wheel will be more than sufficient to get you started. Now, as I've already said, we're going to cover manual shifting in much greater detail in a future episode because it's too much to go into here. But basically, changing gear is all about the timing. When you're changing up through the gears, it's all about changing when you hit the right point during the rev range. So depending on what car you drive, that's going to be a different point. The way you can work this out is by revving the car out to full rev. So in this BMW, if I put my foot down, don't change gear, that's the rev limiter. But I've got lights on my dashboard here, so I can just change gear whenever the 2 red lights appear above the gear indicator. So yes, changing up through the gears is easy. Changing down through the gears is a little more complicated. So generally speaking, you want to do your downshifting during the braking zone before a corner, not during the corner. There are exceptions to that rule, but generally speaking, what you do is you hit the brakes at the 100 meter board here, for example, and then change gear, and then turn into the corner in the appropriate gear. Now, the reason why timing is so important, if you don't change down the gears fast enough, you're going to unsettle the car when you eventually do need to change down the gears in the corner, and also you're not going to utilise the engine braking as much as you possibly can. If you change down the gears too fast, however, what you can do is risk locking up the wheels and tyres and destabilising the car before you even get to the corner. Now, some cars have systems in place which prevent you from shifting down too fast, like this BMW, for example. If I try and brake all of a sudden and shift down really fast, you can see they're only shifted down from 4th to 2nd, not straight down to neutral. So when your car has that system in place, you don't really need to worry about locking up the tyres under braking and shifting down too quickly. However, lots of cars don't have that in place, so the best thing to do, honestly, with gear shifts and manual gear shifts is just practice. Just drive around, get used to the feeling of the upshift, get used to the tone of the rev in the engine of the particular car you're driving, and with downshifts, get used to that gentle, carefully timed downshifts on the braking or during the braking zones on the way into a corner. Plenty more we can get into in future episodes, but I'm going to leave it there for now. Let's get into today's exercise, where the aim is going to be reducing our assists one by one until we can drive cleanly and comfortably with all of them switched off. Fire up your chosen sim and pick a track that you know well. Obviously at this stage you may not know any circuits well, and that's okay, just pick one that looks fairly straightforward to learn. I'd also recommend jumping in a rear-wheel drive car for the sake of this experiment, and ideally something between, say, 150 and 300 brake horsepower. Either a low-powered racing car like a Mazda MX-5, a BMW M2, or a sort of sports car. Now firstly, the aim is going to be to successfully drive around the circuit with some consistency with all of the assists turned on. So I'm driving the BMW M235i once again, and I've gone for Laguna Seca as my circuit. I've got all of the assists on, so that's the driving line, stability control, ABS, traction control, and automatic gears. And I'm going to set a benchmark lap time. Now before you advance in this, I want you to be able to drive consistently with these assists turned on. I want you to obviously learn the track if you don't know it already. Hopefully you've picked one that you do know a little bit. And just make sure that you're comfortable before you go and set this lap time, because we want to try and get a fair representative benchmark. So I'm now fully comfortable with this combination. So what I'm going to do is cross the line, take a note of the lap time, or I actually don't need to because I've got it here on Race Room, and then I'm going to turn off the assists one by one. So first lap here is a 1 minute 45.0. I'm going to pause, head to the options menu, and first of all turn off the ideal racing line. So of course the objective here is to be able to drive around the circuit without the ideal racing line on, something that we covered in the previous episode's exercise. So if you're still unsure about how to find the ideal racing line, go and check out that part once again. Oh, I've gone straight on there and invalidated the lap time, but that doesn't really matter, to be honest. The lap time's not important at this stage, it's all about getting comfortable and familiar. So for me right now, I do know the racing line around Laguna Seca, I am comfortable, so I'm going to move on to the next assist, which is turning off stability control. So I'm going to go straight from high to off and skip all of the middle stages, because even with stability control, we still of course have traction control, which is going to help modulate the power on the exit of the corners and help us avoid spinning. Having the stability control off should just help us carry a little bit more speed in the corners and let us throw the car around a little bit more. So your next phase is driving around with stability control off, everything else the same, and getting comfortable. So once again, you want to be able to get around the circuit without making big mistakes. You want to be consistent. The lap time's not that important, but with stability control off on your chosen game, it would be great if you can get to a stage where you're close to your original benchmark lap time. Here on Race Room, turning that assist off makes a huge difference. I'm already 2.4 seconds up just in the first sector alone, only by turning off stability control. It shows you how much it's actually limiting the movement of the car. So I'm now comfortable and also much, much faster. This is going to be a 1 minute 37.2. which is way, way faster. And I'm ready now to move on to the next assist, which is ABS. Now there's a couple of things you can do here. You can either turn it fully off, or you can turn it to the factory setting. Now I know this BMW has a little bit of ABS as a factory setting, so if I was being realistic, I would run it on that and then just try essentially lowering the amount of ABS. But for the sake of the experiment, and I recommend you try this at least as well, just to see if you can get comfortable, I'm going to turn it fully off, and we're going to practice braking and trying to avoid locking up. So heading into the first corner, I'm going to hit the brakes. There you can hear the lockup, so I know that if I brake around about 80% in this car, I'm going to have a lockup. So now I'm going to pull that back a little bit, brake a little bit less, and there you can see I still slowed down, but I avoided locking up the car. Now if you're really, really struggling with turning ABS off fully, don't worry about it at this stage. Try it, give it a go, see how it feels, see if you can adapt to it, but if you're really struggling, turn it back on, even if it's just slowly reducing the ABS or going for a factory setting, that is okay. We'll come back to it later down the line. So I've actually found a little bit more lap time there, not relying on the ABS. I've done a 136.6, and it's exactly the same story with traction control. This car does have a little bit of traction control by default, but what I'm going to do for the sake of this experiment is turn it off, and I'd recommend again you do the same. Try and see if you can get comfortable and do some consistent laps in the car with it fully turned off. And this one is going to be challenging, so take your time with it, be patient, and if you're really, really struggling with it, if it's demotivating you, try, instead of turning it fully off, just reducing the number slightly. Or in Race Room's case, actually, increasing the number, because the higher the TC number, the less traction control there is, which is the opposite to most games. It's a bit complicated, but let us know down in the comments below what game you're playing, and I'll see if I can help you point in the right direction. I'm also at this stage going to turn on manual gears with auto clutch. So again, if you're comfortable and you want to give it a go, try manual gears as well. And now I'm going to see, with all of the assists turned off, where my lap time is compared to my original benchmark. Okay, spinning at the first corner, really not going to help, but probably relatable for some of you guys. So there we are. After starting off on a 1 minute 45, driving as fast as I could with all of the assists on, I'm now, with all of the assists off, down to a 1:35.9. Now obviously you might not find those sorts of increases yourself. In fact, you might be slower with the assists off until you get up to speed, because of course it's harder to drive, and that's absolutely fine. Just keep plugging away, practice. The idea of this is not to force you to drive with no assists on every car, because lots of cars, as I say, you'll be better off using the factory settings. It's more just to gain an understanding of what the assists are doing and get comfortable, because then, once you're comfortable, if something like this is thrown your way, or a car you drive happens to not have traction control, you're going to be a bit more experienced and a bit more able to cope with it. Let me know down in the comments below which sim you used to do this exercise, which car and track combination, and let me know how you get on. I'm really enjoying making this series. I hope you guys are enjoying watching it as well. And don't worry, hopefully it's been fun so far, but it's going to get more enjoyable, because we're going to be looking at racing soon. We're also going to be looking at finding more lap time, getting faster. There's so much to explore here, and hopefully you guys are on for the ride with me. Do make sure you subscribe to the Traxion channel if you haven't already, so that you don't miss any of our future uploads. Leave us a like if you're enjoying the series so far. And until I see you next time, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.